A black family was excited to begin their dream vacation, stepping onto a first-class flight with smiles and anticipation. But what happened next was nothing short of shocking. A flight attendant accused them of not belonging in first class and demanded they move to the back of the plane. When the family refused, explaining they had valid tickets, things escalated. The flight attendant took it a step further and kicked them off the plane entirely, humiliating them in front of TH. What unfolded next not only stunned everyone on board but set off a chain of events that no one could have imagined. This is a story of resilience, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Stay with me, this is one you won't want to. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today and what you think about standing up to injustice. If you find this story impactful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that highlight the fight for equality. The airport, in all its sprawling and mechanical precision, was a perfect stage for America's silent hierarchies to play out. The polished floors and artificial lighting cast everything in a clinical clarity, everything except the unspoken rules that governed the space. These rules thrived in the shadows of polite smiles and practiced indifference. Tonight, those rules would guide the hand of Eleanor Price. Eleanor, a senior flight attendant with 15 years of service under her belt, was known among her colleagues at Skylux Airlines for her efficiency, her attention to detail, and her unshakable composure. She was the kind of woman who walked through terminals with an air of authority. Her navy uniform crisp, her smile sharp enough to cut through pleasantries. But beneath that polished veneer lay something she herself couldn't fully name, a discomfort that prickled her skin whenever the boundaries of her carefully ordered world were disturbed. The disturbance came that evening in the form of the Morris family. At first glance, they seemed unremarkable. Samuel Morris, a tall man with a quiet confidence, wore a tailored gray suit, his tie slightly loosened as if to concede to the long flight ahead. His wife, Evelyn, graceful and poised, held the hand of their young daughter, Lena, while their teenage son, Marcus, dragged a sleek carry-on bag behind him. They exuded the ease of seasoned travelers, polite smiles, calm voices, no unnecessary fuss. Yet, when Eleanor saw them standing at the gate, their first-class tickets in hand, a quiet unease settled in her chest. How could they afford to be here? The thought slid unbidden into Eleanor's mind. Uninvited yet familiar. She didn't question its arrival, she merely acted on it, cloaking her biases in the language of protocol. "Good evening," she said, her smile professional but devoid of warmth. "Could I ask you to step aside for just a moment? We need to verify something with your tickets." Samuel's brow furrowed slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Is there a problem?" "Oh, no, nothing serious," Eleanor replied, her hands already typing on the gate computer, her eyes scanning the screen as though searching for a flaw. "Sometimes the system flags certain tickets, and we just need to double-check." Behind her, a younger flight attendant named Mia watched the exchange with a raised eyebrow. She had worked alongside Eleanor long enough to recognize the signs. This wasn't protocol, this was intuition, Eleanor's favored euphemism for suspicion. Samuel held Eleanor's gaze, his calm demeanor unyielding. "The system flagged our tickets?" he asked, his voice even but pointed. Eleanor hesitated, her fingers pausing on the keyboard. "It's just a precaution," she said finally, her tone dismissive. Minutes passed. The line of boarding passengers grew restless. But Eleanor didn't seem to notice. Mia, unable to contain herself, leaned closer. "Their tickets are valid, Eleanor," she said under her breath. Eleanor nodded but lingered at the screen a moment longer than necessary. When she finally returned the tickets, her smile was tight. "Everything seems to be in order. Enjoy your flight." The Morris family walked past her without a word, their silence dignified but heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. As they disappeared into the jet bridge, Eleanor turned to Mia. "Don't you think it's unusual?" she asked, her voice low but insistent. "What's unusual?" Mia replied, though she already knew where this was going. "They just don't seem like the typical first-class passengers," Eleanor said, her tone casual, as though discussing the weather. "It's not about the tickets. It's just a feeling." Mia frowned, her voice tinged with irritation. "A feeling, Eleanor? Or something else?" Eleanor's lips tightened, but she said nothing. In her mind, she was merely doing her job, maintaining the unspoken order of the first-class cabin, a space she believed should reflect a certain standard. And tonight, the Morris family didn't fit. The flight itself began smoothly enough. The hum of the engines, the clink of glasses in the galley, the murmur of passengers settling in, everything followed its usual rhythm. But Eleanor couldn't stop herself from glancing toward the Morris family. They sat quietly in their seats. Samuel reading a book, Evelyn helping Lena with a coloring page, and Marcus scrolling through his phone. They didn't demand attention, but their very presence unsettled Eleanor in a way she couldn't explain. When it came time to serve dinner, Eleanor approached their row with a carefully neutral expression. She placed their trays in front of them without making eye contact. Her movements brisk and mechanical. "Excuse me," Evelyn said softly, her voice courteous but firm. "I believe we ordered the vegetarian meals." Eleanor's smile faltered. "I'll check on that," she said, though she knew she wouldn't. Mia, watching from a distance, clenched her fists. She had seen enough. When Eleanor returned to the galley, Mia cornered her. "What are you doing?" she demanded, keeping her voice low but sharp. "You're treating them differently, and you know it." "I don't know what you're talking about," Eleanor said, her tone defensive. "Yes, you do," Mia shot back. "This isn't about protocol. This is about you." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I don't have time for this," she said, brushing past Mia and returning to the cabin. But her colleague's words lingered, echoing in her mind like an unwelcome truth. As the flight progressed, the tension in the first-class cabin grew palpable. Other passengers began to notice Eleanor's behavior, the way she avoided the Morris family's row, the curt tone she used when addressing them. Whispers circulated, subtle but insistent. An older man in the aisle seat, a frequent flyer named Mr. Hargrove, watched the scene unfold with quiet disapproval. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Eleanor could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on her, but she refused to acknowledge it. She convinced herself that she was maintaining order, upholding the unspoken rules of the cabin. What she didn't realize was that she was the one disrupting it. In the quiet moments between service rounds, Eleanor found herself staring at her reflection in the galley's stainless steel panels. For a brief moment, she saw herself as others might see her, not as the consummate professional she prided herself on being, but as someone else entirely. Someone smaller, someone afraid. But just as quickly as the thought surfaced, she pushed it away. There was work to be done, and she couldn't afford to falter. Not now, not ever. As Eleanor straightened her uniform and stepped back into the cabin, she didn't notice the sharp eyes of Mr. Hargrove following her, nor did she hear his low murmur to the passenger beside him. "She'll have to answer for this." And so, the first cracks began to show in Eleanor's carefully constructed world. But the storm brewing just beyond her sightline would force her to confront truths she had spent her entire career avoiding. The stage was set, the curtain had risen, and there was no turning back. The low hum of the engines filled the cabin, a mechanical lullaby meant to soothe the weary souls crossing the Atlantic. But not all were at peace on Flight 512. For Eleanor Price, the quiet unease in her chest had become a steady drumbeat. She walked the aisles of first class with the precision of someone who had mastered her role. Yet the Morris family remained a splinter in her mind. What was it about them? They sat with the same dignity as the other passengers, their demeanor calm, their requests few, yet their very existence in this space, this coveted stretch of plush leather seats and champagne service, felt to Eleanor like an intrusion. "They don't belong here," she thought, not daring to name the prejudice behind the feeling. To her, it wasn't prejudice. It was instinct, a kind of intuition honed over years of dealing with passengers. Though she could never articulate what exactly she was detecting. The Morris family, for their part, did nothing to provoke her. Samuel read his book in silence, his brow furrowing occasionally as if he were the only one on board, unbothered by the turbulence brewing around him. Evelyn guided Lena through her coloring book, her fingers moving with the patience of a mother who had long mastered the art of staying calm under scrutiny. Marcus, the teenage son, kept to himself, his headphones snug over his ears as he watched something on his tablet. They were a picture of poise. But poise, Eleanor thought, could be a mask. In the galley, Eleanor busied herself with the dinner service trays, avoiding the growing tension like one avoids eye contact with a storm on the horizon. Mia, the younger flight attendant, leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. She had watched Eleanor's interactions with the Morris family, her unease turning to anger. "Eleanor," Mia began, her voice low but firm. I need to ask you something. Eleanor didn't look up from the tray she was preparing. If it's about those passengers. I've already told you. It's not about them. Mia interrupted. It's about you. Why are you doing this? Eleanor's hands froze for a moment before resuming their work. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Mia's tone was sharper now. They've done nothing wrong. And yet, you've gone out of your way to treat them differently. Why? Eleanor turned to face her. Her expression defensive. I'm doing my job. Mia, not every decision is about race. Mia's eyes narrowed. No, not every decision is. But this one is. And whether you admit it or not, you're making everyone uncomfortable, not just them. The other passengers see it too. Eleanor opened her mouth to reply but stopped herself. A flicker of doubt passed through her mind. But she pushed it down, refusing to let it take root. I'm just trying to keep things running smoothly, she said finally. Her tone clipped. Mia shook her head in frustration. Running smoothly for who? Eleanor? As the dinner service continued, the tension in the cabin became palpable. Other passengers began to take notice of the disparity in Eleanor's treatment of the Morris family. An elderly woman in the aisle seat watched as Eleanor placed their trays on their table without so much as a glance or word. In contrast, when she served Mr. Hargrove, a white businessman in the next row, her tone was syrupy sweet. Here's your salmon, Mr. Hargrove, Eleanor said with a warm smile. If there's anything else you need, just let me know. Mr. Hargrove thanked her but didn't miss the contrast. As Eleanor walked away, he turned to the woman next to him. Did you see that? He murmured. She nodded, her expression troubled. It's not right, she whispered. They're paying for first class just like the rest of us. Nearby, Marcus Morris glanced up from his tablet, his sharp eyes catching the subtle shifts in the cabin's mood. He nudged his father, who looked up from his book. Samuel followed his son's gaze and saw what Marcus had already noticed, the stares. The whispers, the unspoken disapproval directed not at their family but at Eleanor. Samuel sighed quietly and leaned toward his wife. Evelyn, he murmured, stay calm. Evelyn gave a small nod, her hand tightening on Lena's. We're used to this, she replied softly. As the flight wore on, Eleanor found it harder to maintain her composure. The eyes of the passengers followed her now, their gazes like weights pressing down on her. Even Mia had stopped trying to hide her frustration, her disapproving glances adding to Eleanor's growing discomfort. It all came to a head during the dessert service. Lena, the Morris family's youngest, had finished her meal and was looking at the dessert options listed on the menu. She tugged on her mother's sleeve. Can I have the chocolate mousse, Mama? She asked in a small voice. Evelyn pressed the call button, her expression patient. Eleanor saw the light on their row but chose to serve other passengers first. She told herself it wasn't deliberate that the elderly couple in row 1 needed her attention more urgently, but deep down, she knew she was stalling. When she finally reached their row, her tone was curt. What can I get you? Evelyn smiled politely, masking her irritation. My daughter would like the chocolate mousse. Please. Eleanor nodded and walked away without another word. But when she returned, she placed the dessert on the table with a little too much force, the clatter of the spoon drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Thank you, Evelyn said, her voice steady but edged with steel. Eleanor didn't respond. She turned and walked away, her heart pounding. She felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the cabin. But it wasn't the passengers' judgment that unsettled her most. It was her own growing awareness of the woman she had become. The Morris family remained calm, their silence a quiet defiance that spoke louder than words. But the other passengers were no longer silent. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into hushed conversations. Even Mr. Hargrove, usually a man who kept to himself, leaned forward in his seat to speak to the couple next to him. She's singling them out, he said, his voice low but firm. Someone needs to say something. The elderly woman from earlier nodded. But will it make a difference? Mia, overhearing the conversation, felt a pang of guilt. She wanted to speak up but hesitated, unsure of how to intervene without making things worse. As the plane continued its journey across the Atlantic, the cabin became a microcosm of the larger world, a place where the invisible lines of race and class were drawn and redrawn in silence. And for the first time in her career, Eleanor Price found herself on the wrong side of those lines, her actions exposing the very biases she had spent years pretending didn't exist. The storm was building, and deep down, Eleanor knew it, but she wasn't ready to face it, not yet. Instead, she clung to the only thing she had left, the illusion of control. But illusions, as Eleanor would soon learn, can only last so long. By the time the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight stretch of the flight, the tension in first class had settled into an uneasy quiet. It was the kind of silence that crackled with unspoken truths, the weight of what wasn't said pressing down on everyone. Eleanor Price moved through the aisles, her steps brisk, her face fixed in a mask of professionalism. But the fissures in her composure were beginning to show. The Morris family sat at the center of it all, a calm eye in the storm of Eleanor's unraveling. Evelyn leaned over to tuck a blanket around Lena, whose soft breathing suggested she had finally drifted off to sleep. Marcus had set his tablet aside, his arms crossed as he stared out the window into the vast darkness of the Atlantic. Samuel, however, watched. His eyes followed Eleanor as she moved about the cabin, missing nothing. His gaze wasn't hostile or accusatory. It was simply steady, unflinching. Eleanor could feel that gaze even when she wasn't looking. It unnerved her in ways she couldn't explain, as though Samuel's quiet observation was holding up a mirror she wasn't ready to look into. The first disruption came when the call button in row 3 lit up. Mr. Hargrove, the frequent flyer who had been quietly observing the night's events, gestured for Eleanor as she approached. "Miss Price," he said, his voice carrying the same controlled authority he likely used in boardrooms. "I need a moment of your time." Eleanor hesitated but nodded, leaning down slightly to hear him. "I've been flying with Skylux for years," Mr. Hargrove began, "and I've always found your service exemplary. But tonight," he let the sentence trail off, his meaning clear. Eleanor's posture stiffened. "If there's something specific you'd like to address, sir, I'm happy to assist." "There is," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut through her practiced indifference. "Your treatment of the family in row 5. It's unacceptable." Eleanor's smile faltered. "I assure you, Mr. Hargrove, all passengers are receiving the same level of service." "Are they?" Mr. Hargrove replied, raising an eyebrow. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've gone out of your way to make them uncomfortable." Eleanor straightened, her cheeks burning. "I appreciate your feedback, sir, but I'm simply following procedure." "Procedure?" he repeated, his voice low but incredulous. "Don't insult my intelligence, Miss Price. This isn't about procedure. This is about something else entirely. And you know it." Before Eleanor could respond, Mr. Hargrove leaned back in his seat, his expression one of quiet disdain. "Do better," he said simply, dismissing her. Eleanor retreated to the galley, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. Mia was there, her arms crossed as she watched Eleanor with a mixture of frustration and concern. "He's right, you know," Mia said, breaking the silence. "Not you too," Eleanor snapped, turning to glare at her. "I don't need a lecture." "What you need," Mia replied, her voice calm but firm, "is to look in the mirror. This isn't about them, Eleanor. It's about you." Eleanor's chest tightened, her breathing shallow. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Mia said, stepping closer. "You've been treating that family differently from the moment they boarded. And now the other passengers are noticing. How long before the captain notices? Or worse, corporate?" Eleanor turned away, refusing to answer. She focused instead on rearranging trays that didn't need rearranging, the simple act of tidying giving her a false sense of control. The second disruption came in the form of a small voice. "Excuse me," Marcus said, standing at the entrance to the galley. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet edge to it, the kind of tone that demanded attention without raising volume. Eleanor turned, startled to find the teenager standing there. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes so much like his father's were piercing. "Yes?" Eleanor said, her voice faltering slightly. "My sister's blanket fell," Marcus said, holding up the small fleece in his hand. "She's cold." Eleanor blinked, her mind scrambling for a response. It was such a simple request, but the weight of everything that had happened between her and this family made it feel monumental. "I'll bring it to her," she said finally, reaching for the blanket. Marcus didn't move. He stood there, holding the blanket just out of reach, his eyes locked on hers. "I'll take it myself," he said after a moment, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you." Eleanor stepped back, letting him pass. As Marcus returned to his seat, She stood frozen, the encounter replaying in her mind. There had been no hostility in his tone, no accusations in his words. But his refusal to let her help was its own kind of indictment, a rejection of the authority she had tried so hard to project. The third disruption was louder. "Is there a doctor on board?" The voice came from the main cabin, sharp with urgency. Eleanor and Mia rushed down the aisle, their training kicking in as they assessed the situation. An elderly woman had collapsed, her breathing shallow and her face pale. Passengers crowded around, their murmurs of concern adding to the chaos. "I'm a doctor." Samuel's voice rang out, calm and authoritative. Eleanor turned to see him stepping forward, his hand raised. For a moment, she hesitated, but as she saw the passengers part to let him through, she realized she had no choice but to let him take control. Samuel knelt beside the woman, his movements quick and precise. He checked her pulse, asked a few pointed questions, and issued instructions to Eleanor and Mia with the kind of confidence that left no room for doubt. "Bring me the medical kit," he said, glancing up at Eleanor. She nodded, moving to retrieve it. As she handed him the kit, their eyes met briefly. She saw no anger in his expression, no trace of the judgment she had feared. Instead, there was only focus, a man doing what needed to be done, regardless of how he had been treated. Within minutes, Samuel stabilized the woman's condition, instructing the crew to monitor her closely for the remainder of the flight. As he returned to his seat, the first-class cabin erupted in applause. Eleanor felt the weight of their stares as they looked at her, their expressions ranging from admiration for Samuel to quiet disapproval of her. Back in the galley, Eleanor slumped against the counter, the events of the night crashing down on her. Mia stood beside her, silent for once, her expression unreadable. "I didn't expect that," Eleanor said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Mia looked at her, her gaze steady. "Maybe that's the problem," she said. "You didn't expect it because you never gave them the chance." Eleanor didn't respond. For the first time, she couldn't find the words to defend herself. Instead, she stared out at the cabin, her eyes drawn to the Morris family. They sat quietly, as they had all night, their dignity unshaken despite everything they had endured. And for the first time, Eleanor felt the full weight of her actions, not as a flight attendant enforcing order, but as a human being who had failed to see the humanity in others. The hum of the plane engines was constant, like a dull heartbeat holding the cabin in its grip. Eleanor Price sat in the galley, her hands clenched around a lukewarm coffee cup. She was still reeling from the events of the night. Samuel Morris, with his quiet authority, had done what she could not: calm the passengers, stabilize the crisis, and return the cabin to some semblance of order. And yet, his competence had shaken something in her, something deeper than her pride. It felt like a threat to the fragile sense of control she carried as a shield against her own uncertainties. Mia, standing across from her, didn't bother to hide her irritation. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed, her sharp eyes fixed on Eleanor. For once, she didn't say anything, and that silence spoke volumes. Eleanor wanted to tell her to stop looking, to stop judging, but she didn't have the strength. Instead, she sipped her coffee, willing the heat to anchor her in the moment. But the warmth never reached her chest. There was no denying it now. The cabin was against her. Not openly, not loudly, but in the subtle way that whispers and glances can turn a space hostile. And at the center of it all was the Morris family, quietly defiant, their presence a quiet reproach Eleanor couldn't escape. The next challenge came in the form of Marcus Morris, the teenage boy, who had largely kept to himself for most of the flight, stood now in the aisle near his family's row. He wasn't disruptive or loud, he simply stood there, looking around the cabin with an expression that was hard to read. Eleanor watched him from the galley, her stomach tightening. It wasn't his actions that unsettled her, it was his silence. There was something in the way he carried himself, something unspoken but deliberate. He was drawing attention, but not in a way she could reprimand. The other passengers noticed him too, their gazes flickering toward him, curious and cautious. Eleanor stepped out of the galley, her hands smoothing her uniform as she approached. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Marcus turned to her, his face calm but unyielding. "No, thank you," he said. "I'm just stretching my legs." Eleanor hesitated. It wasn't against the rules, but his presence felt like a challenge, a quiet assertion of his right to be there. She nodded curtly and returned to the galley. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was making a point. One she didn't fully understand. Later, during the second beverage service, Eleanor approached the Morris family's row with a tray of drinks. Evelyn looked up, her expression polite but guarded. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Eleanor asked, her tone overly formal. Evelyn nodded. "Just water, thank you." As Eleanor poured the water, her hand trembled slightly, spilling a few drops onto the tray. She cursed herself silently, but Evelyn didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she chose not to. Samuel, sitting beside her, watched the interaction closely, his gaze steady but unreadable. Eleanor placed the glass in front of Evelyn and turned to Samuel. "And for you, sir? I'll take water as well," he said simply. Eleanor nodded and poured another glass. When she set it down, Samuel spoke again, his voice low but firm. "I'd like to thank you for your assistance earlier, Miss Price. It's important to stay calm during emergencies." Eleanor froze, unsure how to respond. His words were polite, but there was something in his tone, a deliberate weight that made her feel seen in a way she didn't want to be. "Of course," she said quickly. "I'm just doing my job." "Are you?" Samuel asked, tilting his head slightly. His question was quiet, almost casual, but it struck Eleanor like a slap. She stared at him, her composure threatening to crack. But before she could respond, he turned his attention back to his book. The cabin grew quieter as the flight neared its final hours. Many passengers had drifted off to sleep, their bodies slumped awkwardly in their seats. But Eleanor couldn't rest. She moved through the aisles, checking overhead bins, adjusting blankets, performing tasks that didn't need doing just to keep herself occupied. When she reached the Morris family's row, she paused. Lena was curled up against her mother, her small face peaceful in sleep. Evelyn and Samuel sat side by side, their hands loosely intertwined on the armrest. They looked normal, ordinary, and yet, Eleanor couldn't shake the sense that their presence had upended everything she thought she understood about her role. About herself. It wasn't the Morris family who had disrupted the flight. It was her. The realization hit her like a gust of turbulence, knocking the air from her lungs. She stood there for a moment, staring at them, before quickly retreating to the galley. Mia was waiting for her. "You need to sit down," she said, her voice softer now. "You're running yourself ragged." "I'm fine," Eleanor snapped, though her shaking hands betrayed her. Mia sighed, leaning against the counter. "Eleanor, you've been doing this job for years. But tonight, you're acting like it's your first flight. What's going on?" Eleanor didn't answer. She couldn't, because the answer was something she wasn't ready to admit, not to Mia, and certainly not to herself. But the truth was there, growing louder with every passing hour. The problem wasn't the Morris family. It wasn't the other passengers, or Mia, or even the plane itself. The problem was the weight of all the unspoken rules Eleanor had carried with her for years. Rules that told her who belonged and who didn't, who deserved her respect and who didn't. And tonight, those rules were failing her. As the plane continued its journey through the night, Eleanor stood in the galley, staring out at the cabin with a growing sense of unease. She had spent years priding herself on her professionalism, her ability to maintain control. But now, for the first time, she felt adrift, her carefully constructed world slipping through her fingers. And deep down, she knew there was no going back. The cabin was steeped in the stillness of a long-haul flight. The kind of quiet that seemed heavier than silence. Outside, the black expanse of the Atlantic stretched endlessly, a mirror of the night within Eleanor Price. She moved between the rows with deliberate focus, her practiced smile plastered in place. But inside, she felt unmoored. The whispers, the sidelong glances, the presence of the Morris family, they had all become threads unraveling the tightly knit fabric of her self-perception. As she passed the Morris family's row, Eleanor paused. Lena had woken and was rubbing her eyes sleepily. Evelyn whispered softly to her, brushing stray curls from her daughter's face. Samuel leaned forward slightly, his hand resting protectively on Lena's arm. There was nothing unusual about the scene, nothing Eleanor could fault, and yet, their quiet presence still felt to her like a challenge she couldn't name. She walked on quickly, her footsteps muffled by the carpeted aisle. In the galley, Mia sat on a fold-down seat, watching Eleanor with a wary expression. The younger attendant had stopped trying to mask her frustration. "You're working yourself into the ground. Mia said. This isn't about the flight anymore. Is it? Eleanor ignored her, busying herself with a tray of water bottles. Mia sighed and leaned forward, her voice softening. It's about them, isn't it? The Morris family. At the mention of their name, Eleanor's hands faltered. A bottle slipped, rolling across the counter before she caught it. That's enough, Mia, she said sharply. You're out of line. Am I? Mia replied, her tone calm but insistent. Because from where I'm standing, you're the one who's out of line. You've been treating them differently since they boarded. Why? Eleanor turned on her, her face flushed. I'm doing my job. That family isn't my responsibility any more than anyone else in this cabin. Mia shook her head. That's not what this is about. And you know it. You see them sitting in first class. And it bothers you. Why? Eleanor opened her mouth to respond but stopped. For a moment, the truth hovered on the edge of her consciousness. Too painful to acknowledge. Instead, she shook her head and walked away, leaving Mia alone in the galley. The next challenge came in the form of a voice. Excuse me. It was Samuel Morris, standing in the aisle near the galley. His tone was even, polite, but it carried a weight that made Eleanor's heart skip a beat. Yes, Mr. Morris? Eleanor asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. My daughter is feeling a bit warm, Samuel said. Could we have an extra bottle of water, please? Of course, Eleanor replied, reaching for the tray of bottles she had arranged earlier. She handed one to Samuel, avoiding his gaze. Thank you, he said, his tone courteous but firm. He lingered for a moment, his eyes studying her face. You seem tired, he added, his voice almost gentle. Eleanor's eyes darted to his, startled by the unexpected comment. She opened her mouth to respond but found no words. Samuel gave her a slight nod and returned to his seat, leaving Eleanor standing there, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. The murmurs among the other passengers grew louder as the flight wore on. Mr. Hargrove, the businessman from earlier, had begun speaking openly to those around him, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. It's not right, he said to the elderly woman seated next to him. That family has done nothing wrong, and yet they've been treated as if they don't belong here. The woman nodded solemnly. You'd think we'd be past this by now, she murmured, but some things never change. Eleanor caught snippets of their conversation as she passed, her pulse quickening. The discontent in the cabin was growing, and she could feel it coalescing around her. The polite facade she had maintained for years was cracking, and she didn't know how to stop it. Later, as the passengers settled back into their seats, the silence was broken by the sound of Lena's voice. Mommy, why doesn't she like us? She whispered, her words carrying further than she intended. Eleanor froze mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slightly, her eyes flicking toward the Morris family. Evelyn was leaning down to comfort her daughter, her voice too soft to hear. But Samuel's gaze was locked on Eleanor. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a quiet intensity that made her feel exposed. Eleanor turned quickly and retreated to the galley, her hands trembling as she reached for the counter to steady herself. The words echoed in her mind. Why doesn't she like us? In the stillness of the galley, Eleanor finally allowed herself to confront the question she had been avoiding all night. Why did the Morris family unsettle her so deeply? It wasn't their behavior, they had been nothing but polite. It wasn't their presence, they had every right to be in first class. So what was it? As she stood there, staring at her reflection in the stainless steel panels of the galley, the answer came to her, quiet and devastating. It wasn't about the Morris family at all. It was about her, about the silent rules she had learned without realizing it. Rules that told her who belonged and who didn't, who was deserving and who wasn't. And tonight, those rules were failing her. The final challenge came just as the plane began its descent into Paris. A sudden jolt of turbulence shook the cabin, startling the passengers awake. Eleanor moved quickly to reassure them, her voice steady as she instructed everyone to fasten their seatbelts. But as she moved through the cabin, she found her eyes drawn once again to the Morris family. Samuel was helping Lena adjust her seatbelt, his movements calm and practiced. Evelyn held her daughter close, her expression serene despite the turbulence. And Marcus, the teenage son, glanced out the window with quiet confidence, his body relaxed against the seat. They didn't look like a family out of place. They looked like they belonged. For the first time that night, Eleanor allowed herself to wonder what it must feel like to carry the weight of being questioned not openly, but in the quiet, insidious ways that leave no room for confrontation, only doubt. She wondered what it must feel like to be gracious in the face of such scrutiny, to meet every slight with dignity. As the plane descended toward the glowing lights of Paris, Eleanor realized that the storm inside her was far greater than the turbulence outside. It wasn't the Morris family who didn't belong. It was the rules she had carried with her all these years, the ones that told her who to value and who to doubt. Those rules were crumbling now. And with them, the version of herself she had always believed in. And for the first time, Eleanor didn't know who she would be when the plane touched the ground. The plane shuddered softly as it began its final descent, the city of Paris twinkling below like a promise Eleanor Price wasn't ready to keep. She stood at the front of the cabin, her hands gripping the edge of the galley counter, the knuckles pale against the metal. The cabin lights were dimmed, casting the space in muted shadows. But Eleanor felt as though every passenger's eyes were on her, silent, expectant, accusing. Samuel Morris sat upright in his seat, his posture calm but commanding. Beside him, Evelyn cradled Lena, who had drifted back to sleep despite the turbulence. Marcus, headphones resting around his neck, stared out the window, his reflection faintly visible against the darkened glass. They weren't doing anything extraordinary, but their presence silent, unwavering, pressed against Eleanor like a weight she could no longer carry. As the plane dipped lower, a faint hum of unease rippled through the passengers. A flight attendant's voice over the intercom reassured them that the descent was routine. But Eleanor could feel the cabin's collective tension. It wasn't just the turbulence, it was everything that had gone unspoken over the course of the flight. Mia approached her in the galley, her face unreadable but her eyes sharp. "We need to prepare for landing," she said, her voice brisk. Eleanor nodded but said nothing. Mia lingered for a moment, watching her, before sighing and turning away. It wasn't that Eleanor didn't know what needed to be done. The routine of landing was second nature by now, securing the cabin, ensuring passengers were in their seats, double-checking the overhead compartments. But tonight, the familiar rituals felt like a mask she no longer knew how to wear. She stepped into the aisle, her smile fixed but brittle, and began her final walk through the cabin. As she passed the Morris family, she hesitated. Samuel looked up, meeting her eyes, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. There was no anger in his expression, no judgment, only a quiet clarity that cut through her defenses. "Thank you for your assistance earlier, Miss Price," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. "It made a difference." Eleanor froze, her mind scrambling for a response. "It was my pleasure," she managed, the words catching in her throat. Samuel nodded, his gaze steady. "I hope this flight was as enlightening for you as it was for us." Eleanor opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. She moved on quickly, her heart pounding, the weight of his words trailing her like a shadow. The plane landed smoothly, the wheels kissing the runway with a softness that belied the turbulence of the journey. As it taxied toward the gate, the cabin filled with the sounds of passengers gathering their belongings and murmuring in low voices. Eleanor stood near the exit, her posture stiff, her hands folded tightly in front of her. One by one, the passengers disembarked. Mr. Hargrove passed by, his expression neutral but his eyes holding a trace of disappointment as they met Eleanor's. The elderly woman from row 3 gave her a small nod, her face lined with quiet disapproval. Each interaction felt like a verdict, unspoken but undeniable. Finally, the Morris family approached. Lena, now awake, clutched Evelyn's hand as they moved toward the exit. Marcus walked beside Samuel, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted slightly, a picture of quiet strength. Samuel paused as they reached Eleanor. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching but kind. "Thank you for the flight," he said, his tone polite but firm. "We hope to fly with Skylux again." Evelyn gave Eleanor a small, measured smile, her eyes holding a hint of something Eleanor couldn't name. "Take care," she said simply, before guiding Lena down the jet bridge. As they walked away, Eleanor felt a hollow ache in her chest. It wasn't just guilt, it was the realization that she had been seen. Truly seen, in a way she had spent her entire career avoiding. Back in the galley, Eleanor busied herself with cleaning up, her movements mechanical. Mia watched her silently for a while before speaking. They handled it better than I would have, she said, her voice soft. Eleanor didn't respond. She kept her eyes on the counter, her hands wiping down a tray that was already spotless. Mia stepped closer, her tone growing firmer. You know, this didn't have to go the way it did. But now that it's over, you have a choice. Eleanor looked up, her eyes meeting Mia's. What choice? She asked, her voice flat. You can keep pretending this didn't happen, Mia said, her gaze steady. Or you can take a good, hard look at yourself and figure out why it did. Eleanor bristled, her instinct to defend herself rising like a shield. But she couldn't summon the words. Not this time, because deep down, she knew Mia was right. Later, as she walked through the empty airport terminal, Eleanor felt the weight of the night settle over her. The polished floors reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, each step echoing in the cavernous space. She thought about Samuel's words, about the calm strength in Evelyn's smile, about the quiet defiance in Marcus's gaze. She thought about Lena's question, why doesn't she like us? Eleanor stopped walking, her breath hitching in her throat. She stood there in the middle of the terminal, her reflection staring back at her from the glass walls. For the first time, she allowed herself to confront the truth she had been running from all night. It wasn't just the Morris family she had failed. It was herself. Because the rules she had followed for so long, the unspoken hierarchies, the quiet biases had done more than shape her actions. They had shaped her identity. And now, standing alone in the empty terminal, Eleanor realized she didn't like the person those rules had made her. The realization was as heavy as it was liberating. And as she stood there, she made a silent promise to herself. This flight would not define her. It would change her. Because it had to. Eleanor Price arrived at her small apartment just as the sun began to rise. The world outside stirred gently awake. But Eleanor felt as though she were dragging the weight of the night behind her. She placed her bag on the floor and slumped into the chair by the window. Outside, the city carried on in its familiar rhythm, indifferent to her unraveling. She hadn't been able to escape the questions that echoed in her mind since the flight. Why had she reacted the way she did? Why had the Morris family, simply existing, disrupted her so deeply? And why had their quiet dignity made her feel so unmoored? These weren't questions she could answer with the kind of efficiency that had always been her hallmark. They demanded something more, something she wasn't sure she could give. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion overtake her. But even in sleep, the questions followed. When she woke hours later, the room was bathed in harsh midday light. She reached for her phone instinctively and saw the email notification from Skylux Airlines. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling. The words blurred as her eyes skimmed over them. Pending investigation, temporary suspension, evaluation of conduct. Eleanor had always prided herself on her unblemished record, her ability to maintain control in any situation. And now, that record was in question because of one family, one flight, one night she couldn't take back. But this wasn't just about her job. It was about the mirror the Morris family had held up to her. A mirror she hadn't asked for, but one that refused to be ignored. Eleanor spent the next few days in a state of restless inertia. She avoided the news, the internet, anything that might remind her of the flight. But avoidance was a thin shield. And the thoughts came anyway, unbidden. Relentless. She thought about Lena's whispered question. About Samuel's quiet strength. About Evelyn's knowing smile. She thought about Marcus, standing in the aisle with a confidence that defied her unspoken doubts. And she thought about herself. About the silent rules she had followed all her life. Rules that told her who belonged where. Rules that made her feel safe, even as they kept others excluded. She had always believed she was fair, professional, impartial. But now, those beliefs felt as fragile as the facade she had worn on Flight 512. On the third day, Eleanor found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman who looked back at her seemed unfamiliar, tired, hollow, unsure. She thought about what Mia had said, "You have a choice." And for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to consider what that choice might look like. She picked up her phone and hesitated for a long moment before dialing a number she hadn't used in years. Liam Price. The voice on the other end answered. Her younger brother sounded the same, warm, patient, steady. "Liam," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "It's me." There was a pause, and then Liam's tone softened. "Ellie, it's been a while." "It has," she admitted, the words catching in her throat. I need your help. Liam didn't respond immediately, but when he spoke, his voice was calm and steady. I'm listening. Eleanor told him everything about the flight, about the Morris family, about the way their presence had exposed something in her she couldn't ignore. She spoke haltingly at first, but as the words came, they poured out in a torrent, as though they had been waiting for years to be spoken. When she finished, there was silence on the other end of the line. Eleanor braced herself for judgment, but it didn't come. Ellie, Liam said finally, his voice gentle, this is a start, but if you really want to change, it's going to take more than an apology. You need to confront the things you've buried for a long time. Eleanor nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I don't know if I can. She admitted. You can, Liam said firmly, but you have to be willing to sit with the discomfort. You have to let it teach you. That evening, Eleanor began the process Liam had suggested. She started by reading about unconscious bias, about the ways it shapes behavior in ways most people don't even realize. At first, the words felt abstract, distant, but as she continued, they began to take on the shape of her own actions, the doubts she had harbored about the Morris family, the small slights she had justified as professionalism, the unspoken rules she had relied on without questioning their validity. The mirror became clearer, and what it reflected was painful to see. But Eleanor didn't look away. 2 days later, she attended her first workshop on equity and inclusion. She sat in the back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, feeling out of place among the small group of attendees. The facilitator, a woman named Camille, spoke with calm authority about the ways bias can manifest in everyday interactions. Most of us don't wake up in the morning and decide to be unfair. Camille said, but fairness isn't about intentions, it's about impact. And sometimes, the impact of our actions can reinforce inequalities we didn't even realize we were perpetuating. Eleanor felt the words land like a punch to the gut. She thought about Flight 512, about the Morris family's calm in the face of her hostility, about the way Samuel had thanked her even as she failed to see his dignity. When the workshop ended, Eleanor approached Camille hesitantly. Thank you for the session, she said, her voice quiet. I have a lot to learn. Camille smiled gently. The fact that you're here is a good start. But learning is just the first step. What you do with that learning is what matters. Eleanor nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what the next steps would look like, but she knew she couldn't go back to who she had been. That version of herself no longer felt like home. Later that night, Eleanor sat by her window, staring out at the city lights. For the first time in years, she felt something shift within her. It wasn't absolution, she knew that wouldn't come easily, if at all, but it was a beginning. A small light breaking through the shadows she had carried for so long. She thought about the Morris family and the quiet grace with which they had endured her treatment. And she made a silent promise to herself. The next time she crossed paths with someone like them, she would see them not through the lens of her own insecurities, but as they truly were. The shadows in her heart were still there, but they didn't feel so suffocating anymore. For the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that change was possible, not easy, not quick, but possible. And as she closed her eyes, the weight of her guilt gave way to the faintest flicker of hope. The morning sunlight filtered through Eleanor Price's window, soft and golden, a marked contrast to the gray weight she had carried since Flight 512. It had been weeks since that fateful journey, and though the world outside her small apartment had moved on, Eleanor's inner world remained tumultuous. Yet, there was a shift, a sense that she was no longer merely floating in uncertainty but swimming toward something ashore she couldn't yet see but believed must exist. Her suspension had been extended while Skylux Airlines conducted its investigation. The weight felt like an indictment, every day an unspoken judgment. Yet, for once in her life, Eleanor wasn't focused on what the world thought of her. She was focused on herself, on entangling the knots of a lifetime she hadn't even known existed. One morning, she received an unexpected email from Skylux Airlines' HR department. She read it slowly, her heart pounding. Subject: Invitation to Equity and Inclusion Training Program. Dear Ms. Price, as part of our ongoing commitment to improving the Skylux customer experience, we are piloting a new training program focused on equity, inclusion, and unconscious bias. Given your years of service and recent feedback, we believe your participation in this program could provide valuable insights for both you and the organization. The program begins next Monday. Attendance is mandatory, but we hope it will also be meaningful. Regards. Skylux Training Department. Eleanor sat back in her chair, the weight of the message settling over her. Attendance was mandatory, yes, but the phrasing left her room to see this as something more: a second chance. A chance to begin proving, not to the airline, but to herself, that she could change. The training session was held in a bright, modern conference room at Skylux headquarters. Eleanor arrived early, her nerves taut as she walked through the glass doors. She half expected to see the Morris family there, their gazes heavy with quiet judgment. But of course, they weren't. Instead, she was greeted by a diverse group of attendees, fellow flight attendants, ground staff, managers, people she had worked alongside for years but never truly known. At the front of the room stood Camille, the facilitator from the workshop Eleanor had attended weeks earlier. Her presence was calming, her voice steady as she welcomed the participants and introduced the agenda for the day. This training isn't about blame, Camille began, her eyes scanning the room. It's about awareness. Awareness of the biases we all carry and the ways those biases shape our actions, often without us even realizing it. Eleanor felt a pang of discomfort at those words, but instead of pushing it away, she let herself sit with it. That discomfort, she was beginning to understand, was where the learning happened. The day was filled with exercises designed to challenge assumptions. In one activity, they were asked to sort passengers into hypothetical boarding groups based solely on descriptions. Eleanor felt a sharp jolt when she realized how quickly she had made judgments about who belonged in first class versus economy. She wasn't alone. Several colleagues expressed similar realizations, their faces a mix of shame and determination. During a break, Eleanor found herself speaking with a younger flight attendant named Rosa. "It's hard," Rosa admitted, her voice low. "I've always thought of myself as fair. But when I look at the choices I've made, who I've paid attention to, who I've overlooked, I'm not so sure anymore." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. "It's like seeing yourself in a cracked mirror," she said softly. "The reflection isn't what you thought it was." Rosa glanced at her, something like gratitude in her expression. "Exactly." As the day went on, the exercises grew more personal. In one, they were asked to write about a moment when they had made someone feel invisible. Eleanor hesitated, the pen heavy in her hand. But then the memory of the Morris family came rushing back: the reassigned seats, the curt tone, the dismissal of Lena's small request for water. She wrote it all down, her handwriting shaky but deliberate. When it was time to share, Eleanor hesitated, but then she stood, her knees trembling as she faced the room. "I want to talk about a mistake I made," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It happened on Flight 512. And it involved a family who deserved better than the way I treated them." The room was silent as Eleanor recounted the story, not just what she had done, but why. She spoke of the biases she hadn't even known she carried, of the way they had shaped her actions and her sense of authority. When she finished, she sat down quickly, her face hot with shame. Camille stepped forward, her voice warm but firm. "Thank you for sharing, Eleanor. Recognizing our own biases is one of the hardest steps we can take. But it's also one of the most important." Eleanor nodded, her chest tight. It didn't feel like enough, not yet. But it was a start. The training ended with a discussion about moving forward. Camille emphasized the importance of turning awareness into action, of holding oneself accountable while also being patient with the process. As the participants filed out, Rosa caught Eleanor's arm. "Thank you," she said simply, "for sharing. It made me feel less alone." Eleanor managed a small smile. "We're all figuring this out," she said, "one step at a time." That evening, Eleanor sat by her window, staring out at the city lights. She thought about the Morris family and wondered where they were now. She thought about Lena's question, "Why doesn't she like us?" and Samuel's quiet strength. She thought about Evelyn's knowing smile, the way it had pierced through her defenses. And then, for the first time since that flight, Eleanor picked up a pen and began to write. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Morris, I am writing to you with the deepest regret for the way I treated your family on Flight 512. My actions that night were unprofessional and, more importantly, unfair. They reflected biases I am only now beginning to confront. And for that, I am truly sorry. Your family showed me a grace I did not deserve. And it has stayed with me. It has challenged me to look at myself with honesty and to begin a journey of change not just for myself, but for the people I interact with every day. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you can believe in the sincerity of my words. Thank you for holding up a mirror I didn't want to face but desperately needed. With respect and humility. Eleanor Price. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. She didn't know if she would ever send it, but writing it felt like a release, a first step toward something better. The next morning, she woke early, her mind clear. She wasn't the person she wanted to be, yet not even close. But for the first time, she felt the faintest stirrings of hope. Change was possible. She could see that now. And she was ready to begin.